slightly changed title to be a little more specific about a specific thing. So not just, you know, the Mrima after 1873, but slave trafficking there. And I wanted to just point out that this paper picks up, and this is something I think we should all be thinking about as the conference is on its downward trend. This paper picks up at least 5 other papers. Lindsay Stevenson talks about short-distance linkages, and this is definitely a study of short-distance linkages. Emilio Ibenschutz mentions the 1873 Slave Trade Suppression Treaty, which I actually begin with. Al-Johara Al-Thani talks about the continuing need to study the slave trade. Fahad Bashara mentions the importance of writing and of letters, which something comes up, and then Stefan Pradin is going to talk about Jua, and you will actually see Jua on one of these maps that I'm going to show you. So basically, this begins, I've written previously an article, chapter called The Other Middle Passage, which looks sort of at the Indian Ocean in contrast to the Atlantic slave trade. And this really just looks at this short period, a 10-year period, after the last of the successive anti-slave trade treaties that the British imposed on Zanzibar, and the changes that came about because of that. One of these changes was that since it was no longer legal, once the treaty was signed in June of 1873, to send ships directly from Kivinji, which was the main slave trading port, to Zanzibar, and the Zanzibar market was closed according to the treaty. People were then marched up in the interior up to the Mrima coast, and so to ports like Bagamoyo, Mbwamaji, Tanga, Pangani, and then smuggled across. And that's really what I'm looking at here. And I was looking at it because I've done the same thing in the Mozambique Channel. I'm interested in these small hops that in these certain areas. So one thing to note about this, the sources are all British, and there are both strengths in that they're the only things we have, and limitations. And Matt Hopper and I have written about this and the nature of translation of these things and who the translators were and what the Brits thought they were saying. So one has to be very careful in using these, but they are the only sources we have, and that's important to do. It's important to note, too, that the slave trade reached its height in the 1860s, and the only really reliable, if they're reliable, data we have are the figures that Burton reported from Kivinji, which all of us have cited in some place or another. And the other two things to notice as background to this was the devastating cholera epidemic of 1869-70, which really killed thousands of people in the labor, including bonded labor, and also the exceptional hurricane that destroyed Zanzibar's clove plantations in 1872 and made Pemba the central locus for clove production, and therefore the central demand for labor from that time on. So in this paper, I'm looking at only these accounts that refer to the decade after 1873. Let me make sure I've got the right, okay. This is the basic, your basic East African coast north of Cape Delgado. And to remember that this is smuggling, and this is when these British sources are from. So one of the things, the next section of my paper, I talk about the trip that Frederick Elton took to go along the coast. He actually goes down to Kilwa eventually, but he does it sort of backwards. He starts from Dar es Salaam and goes down and then comes back up and then he goes down again. And John Kirk, who was the consul at this point, wants him to register the British Indian subjects who own slaves. And he does this. He registers over 1,000. But in the process, he also sees a number of caravans going up the coast. And this is, you have to be suspicious of these things, but this is one of the few eyewitness accounts where he actually is passing, and he doesn't do anything because he's not charged to. This is not illegal. So at one of these places, he gets to a place called, and actually I'll show you on the map, if there's not a pointer, but it's up in this area. He gets to a place called the Pafuni Ford, which is in Pwani district. And he passes this big caravan. This more or less, obviously, there wasn't an artist on hand or a photograph, but it matches his description of what he saw. And there's a usual kind of abolitionist lingo that goes along with it. Basically, he leaves it alone. He just lets it pass. When he gets to Kasiju, which is further down on the coast, when he gets to Kasiju, he learns that the caravan was, quote, 400 strong and had come from the Niassa district direct to Kilwa, and there accepted an offer of $35 a head all round for the slaves, and this is the important part, made by an agent from Pemba. The money to be paid on delivery at either Sadani, Pangani, Wasin, or Mombasa, the port to be named by the purchaser, who was to smuggle them across the island at his own risk. So it's a different system altogether. The other thing he learned about Kasiju, which is an interesting development, is that it is, quote, a resting place for the caravans. Huts being built for the slaves, cooking trenches dug, stocks and extra irons kept in readiness, and an Arab overseer in charge of the arrangements for victualling. A new branch of industry has also been established. The inhabitants having discovered that buying up 6 slaves from the Kangs, feeding them into condition, and reselling them is a profitable and easy means of additional income. And what's fascinating to me about this is that there's been this sudden change in what's possible in the export slave trade, and people are responding to it in a very entrepreneurial way. I mean, this is a slave trade, but they're taking advantage of something that wasn't possible before because slaves were going directly from Kilwa Kaminji up the coast. And Elton, like everybody, identifies Pemba as the main market. And he says, at one point, he's on this trip in late February of 1874, he's in Pangani, and I can't try to, okay. He's at Pangani, just below Tanga on this map. Found many Arabs, which he felt was a sign that there were slaves in the neighborhood. And he says, according to what he learned, quote, several successive runs have been made from the river, the dhows ostensibly loading goods from the town during the day. The slaves at the favorable moment are shipped at night, their irons knocked off, and which is a big issue, obviously, and a fair wind lands the cargo at Pemba in a few hours, no one in Pangani being wiser than anybody else until after the event. The few hours, it's interesting, it's a short haul, it's about 40 kilometers or so, but what people say is the normal time means the normal and the best conditions, and you get this all, I've done a lot of work recently on travel across the Mozambique Channel, and normally from Madagascar to Mozambique on, it would take 3-5 days, but sometimes it took 15 or 16 or 17 days. Depends on the currents, it depends on the winds, it depends on all kinds of stuff. So this is sort of normal. But what's the key thing I wanted to point out with bringing up Elton's voyage is that it's a reminder that any discussion of Indian Ocean circularities must also account for events in the littoral hinterlands, not just on the water. That's an important, several people have sounded a similar thing. So the next section of my paper I call From the Mrima to the Inshore and Offshore Islands. And there, according to Kirk and some of the other British sources, there was anywhere from, at the beginning of 1873, after the treaty, there were maybe 10 to 12,000 slaves a year being smuggled across the island to Pemba. I don't know about that, but that's what they said. And Kirk complained, and this is kind of standard, we could not capture more than 5% of the slaves that were being taken over to Pemba. So he gives some figures of how many there were, and was concerned that the persistent demand for labor, at Pemba would cause smuggling. And it's this movement across from the Mrima coast over to the islands that I'm calling the shortest middle passage. Another, this is nothing new, but the big problem for the British was to determine who was legitimately a slave who could be liberated. And they had what were called raw slaves and then old slaves. And old slaves meant that you were enslaved before 1875. Nah, okay. That old slaves had been smuggled, were from before 1873, and so they were domestic, and you couldn't take them. So this was always very difficult to do. The other thing that made this difficult, and this is something that several people at Hideaki has written about, is that Arab ships, Comorian ships, now started to get French flags. They would get them at Nushi Bay or at Mayotte. This is also true in the Gulf. And then the British couldn't seize them because they were protected by a treaty. So as I go on to the paper, what I do is particularly look, there's a number of cases which are really interesting. One of them, I'll just say, moved a group of 8 captives were picked up who were new slaves. And these are always interesting because it gives a name and it gives an ethnic identification. And 3 of them, these were captives who went from, see, I had a problem with it. This is a map of Pemba. Let's see. So where they went to Chole, and Juwane, we're going to be hearing about that from Stefan Karine. Chole is where a lot of the slave owners on Mafia stayed, and also Ras Kisimani was a major center for the slave trade. So this is coming from small ports around the Rufiji Delta, going across to the Mafia Islands, and then up to either small ports in Zanzibar or more likely to Pemba. And the individuals are named as people like Mataka Niasa, Mitimiji Mbesa, so you know exactly where they're coming from. There's also slaves who get landed at Shumbe Island, which I think they're now tourist boats that go out there from Zanzibar town, also down at Kizim Kazi. So in other words, they weren't taking people to Zanzibar because the slave market was closed, and it was illegal to do so. So the last part of the paper that I will talk about, if I can, is I quote a long document, not relatively, it's got 6 different one-paragraph narratives. And I quote the entire document because of what it reveals. This is a ship that was seized in 1883, a dhow called the Leopoldine, which is interesting. And it was owned by a Goan named Alexis Mascarenhas, who lived near Bagamoyo. Its master was somebody named Mtwana bin Hashim. And I give these things in full, and let me read just one of them because it'll help to contextualize what I'll finish with. This is from Almas Miao, who was a Yao. He says, I am a slave. My master's name is Sheikh Mahmud bin Muslim El Farai. I was sent up country with a caravan to buy ivory, and while we were there, we heard of Sheikh Hamud's death. So we returned to the coast and arrived a month ago. There are a man and a woman in the dhow with me, both belonging to Sheikh Hamud. The man's name is Matuma, the woman's is Chipanya. I have been the slave of Sheikh Hamud since I was a boy, and Matuma has been a long time with our master. We were brought across by the captain by force. We have come to Zanzibar by our own free, we have not been brought by force, sorry. We have come to Zanzibar of our own free will, and we have had nothing to eat in Bagamoyo and thought it better to come to Zanzibar. I am always going back and forwards between the coast and Zanzibar. I left it last year on this trip and went as far as Karagwe. So he went way up country to Karagwe. You can see in the upper left-hand map. And he then says, he gives a price of what they paid, and he says, I want to be free. I don't want to remain a slave. And then he finishes up. A couple of other people mentioned that they were up country when a letter came from Zanzibar, and then they came down. So this is the interesting thing. Here's these people who are up in Tabora, who are, some of whom at least, the men are used to going back and forth, and they hear about their owner's death. And they hear about this in a letter. We don't know whether the letter was written in Arabic or Swahili, but one of that party, one of the enslaved members, could read it. And they come down, and it's clear that it doesn't say it, but it's clear they're coming down to clear the debts of the family before, as they're doing this. The last person, and then I've about 2 minutes and I'll finish up. One of the people who's mentioned is Talfak Mgindo, so he's from southeast Tanzania. He says, I'm a slaver on board the dhow and pull the ropes. So this is interesting because the last statement comes from the Mtwana bin Hashim, the captain. I am a free man and the captain of the dhow. And he says, my cargo is muhogo and mkindu. Muhogo, cassava, mkindu, palm leaves. And I have 12 or 13 passengers on board. They said they were all free. And then he goes on subsequent, says, the boy Tawfiq is not my slave and is a sailor on board. Well, it turned out that Tawfiq probably was a slave. But the interesting thing about this part of it is that this man's name was, the master's name, he's identified by Tawfiq as an akoda and as a muqaddim, a term, muqaddami, from the Arab-Persian Gulf region that means a bosun, an officer who is sometimes also called Nakod Ashira. Quote, the person who gives orders when to hoist or lower the sails. And that's exactly what Tawfiq says he was doing on the dhow. He was doing, so there's an interesting, one of the few times I've ever found this kind of information from an African voice translated, to be sure. And then the final thing that's interesting is that Mtwana means a male slave. So if he was free, he was a freedman. He'd been freed, and he had the name of Mtwana. And the other final thing is that this short distance normally takes about 4 hours, but this trip took 4 days. We don't know if it started 4 days before and it took 4 days before they were captured, but it's a 4-day journey. So there's not as much as one would like in some of these things. I've been through most of them pretty carefully, but there is, I think, useful information in terms of giving, one, an African voice, and two, giving us a sense of the difficulties of traveling, and the fact that when people were being smuggled across from the Mrima mainly to Pemba, but also to South Zanzibar, that they were often not doing it in a direct line. In the case of Pemba, they were going to Fundu Island and then would go. So there's a 2 and sometimes 3-step stage, quite apart from how many times a person might have been owned and resold before they got there. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for everything and for inviting me. I really feel very honored to be in this very august company. And so the work that I'm presenting is part of a new book project on the history of the Konkan coast, and I'm happy to talk more about the project as a whole in the Q&A. But one of the things that I'm looking at and thinking about what makes a coast, like as a coherent historical region, is to actually look at slaves and slave mobility. In doing that, like one of the things with Professor Alpers' work, obviously there is a well-developed literature on Indian Ocean slavery, but what intrigues me is that actually really thinking about the connections between slavery in South Asia, in the interior especially, and the oceanic networks of slavery. And what I, as other South Asians have noticed, that there's still really a paucity of thinking of literature on slavery in the field. And here I want to do, there was a very important volume that Richard Eaton and Indrani Chatterjee did on looking at slavery in South Asia, which became sort of the historiographical beginning of where I started to really think about this. And Eaton offers a very capacious definition of slavery that I think is useful because it captures something very important in thinking about slavery in South Asian context, which is caste. But what also is important is that Indrani Chatterjee notices that one of the most important places where we have to start really thinking about slavery in the South Asian context is this connection between interior networks of slavery and oceanic networks. And that's really what I'm trying to do by looking at slavery in the Konkan coast, and to do it specifically, that Goa is this kind of paradigmatic site in which we can think about these connections. Now, Goa, I mean, which is really like where I sort of think from in the South Asian context, has this interesting sort of historical and historiographical exceptionalism, in part because of its history of Portuguese colonialism, its Catholic plurality, population, and so it often gets bracketed from South Asian history and becomes sort of part of Portuguese imperial history or a sort of peculiar subgenre of Indo-Portuguese history. But this is a kind of statist view that is also, that plays into replicating political boundaries associated by states that I think often dominates South Asian historiographical, sort of geographical imaginations. And rather, like what I'm saying is that the Konkan coast, despite political fragmentation, is actually still a very connected place. And looking at Goa as a linchpin for this coast is really what I'm trying to do. And what that does is, of course, it opens up the Goan archives, which is a fantastic place to really think about slavery. So what I really want to do today is to kind of give a quick overview of the sorts of materials that I'm drawing on in doing this work. And it's a really, really rich source space that I'm thinking with. Including church records, sort of baptismal death and marriage records from the Goan archives, legal sort of laws regulating slavery, as well as diplomatic correspondence, which is a really intriguing place to kind of look for this. So when I was writing my first book, I'd come across this phrase, this letter, which had really sort of haunted me, which is really partly where this project came from, where Niccolò Lantilotto writes to Ignatius from Kollam in southern India, and he's sort of asking for clarity on questions related to slaves. And this letter is kind of really striking, in part because he describes like how ubiquitous slavery is, and then also the ways in which enslaved people are coming into the orbit of the church. And partly what he's doing is also to ask for like clarification. So after that first paragraph, for example, where he's talking about, sort of the ubiquity of slavery and then how it's connected to really conditions of famine, whether it was licit, for example, to give restitution if a slave is bought at a very low price and then the price of the slaves goes up. So there's sort of really, really arcane discussions going on in this letter. But it's really interesting where you also see, like, obviously, like the existence of things like debt bondage and self-sales into slavery as a practice, and the ways in which the Portuguese are obviously already beginning to tap into existing modalities of enslaved labor. Miguel Weiss, and so the church is really interesting in its concerns because it's not really slavery as a problem itself, it's really the question of then what happens to the confessional identity of slaves. That's the concern. So the Vicar General, Miguel Weiss, writes to the king, and really his concern is not so much the fact of slavery, but what happens with Portuguese who then sell slaves back to Muslims. Here, he's talking about slaves who are being sold in Bhatkal and other parts. So there's clearly cross-confessional commercial ties in the slave trade. So despite some sort of spiritual concerns around this, that leads to a short-lived legal provision that allowed Christian converts to claim the status of freed men. The provision is actually formally rescinded by 1559, but I found evidence that the memory of this law is so powerful that people still come to Goa, a century after expecting this to be the case. So it's a really interesting case of like how this law creates its own memories and pulls people to the interior, to Goa for this reason. And I want to say that like this work is really interested in the kind of social reality and less interested in kind of the laws around it. There's tons of legal documents, both ecclesiastical and civil, but I'm really interested in kind of thinking about what the social history of this is. One of the really important things is really there's this robust country trade that's happening up and down the coast that's absolutely crucial to this. And so there is, the oceanic trade is important, but it's really the country trade that's actually like probably padding out the numbers here. And so private trading is rife, and you know, by the 18th century, you have really important Goan commercial families that are specializing in in the slave trade, like the Mahamites. And from what I can tell, African slaves are really luxury commodities, and so the vast majority of slaves are really lower caste people originating or you know, coming up and down the Konkan coast. And I'll show you why I'm saying this, like based on, so I have evidence both of like some Arabian Mission records as well as baptismal records. So this, you know, this very famous engraving from the Ethnography sort of represents the kind of like slave market in Goa, and this is really the image that we have. But actually, what's probably going on is that sort of large-scale slaveholding is probably really happening only in these big institutional contexts like the convents or rich families in Goa, but there's much more sort of everybody has slaves, even in the villages, right? So this very famous, like, you know, quote from Pierre de Laval when he visits and describes the slave market, the slave auctions of the Rue de Direita, and here, obviously, sexual slavery is, again, part of what's driving the big slave markets. But the other types of records, like I have a whole base of inquisitorial records, including of records of Goans who are enslaved and then taken to other parts of the Portuguese world, including like Morocco, and so the you know, Indians end up being the second largest group of enslaved people after Africans in Lisbon in the 16th century. But what I'm also seeing in these records is that it actually challenges some of our historiographical commonplaces in South Asia. And I have an article in Past and Present that looks at this one particular record of this Ethiopian slave called Gabriel, which is a really interesting kind of document to think with, because the image of the Ethiopian slave in South Asian historiography is really sort of dominated by their status as military slaves or as really royalty, as you know, these kind of iconic images of Malik Ambar, and really that's persisted. I mean, so this is the last sort of Ethiopian kingdom of the Sidi Heather Khan of Janjira in 1930, and so. Gabriel, however, suggests that there was lots of Ethiopian slaves who were not sort of part of this kind of military elite slavery, but rather sort of melded into the kind of everyday ubiquitous forms of slave labor. And so he is probably of Jewish origin for the Beta Israel community. He's enslaved by Christians, sold by Arabs, converted on the way to Shaul, entering through Nizam Shah, he held Shaul. So Shaul is both Portuguese and Nizam Shahi. So like that's part of why the porosity of these borders are important to remember. He's taken into the interior. He's falls in love with the Christian slave girl of his master. The two of them run away to Portuguese-held Shaul, where he converts. But then he's given to a Christian Ethiopian family that's supposed to sort of cement them as a convert, but it's clear that he's again enslaved by this family, who's trying to pressure him into a sort of more advantageous marriage for the family. And then he runs away again into the interior, spends 12 years there, probably living on the patronage of Sufi networks, is caught by a Portuguese slave captain, brought back to Shaul to face the Inquisition, enslaved again in Goa, this time in a big college of St. Thomas. And what's interesting is there he tries to run away, and he's in the denunciations, we actually get a picture of the other slaves who denounce him, which includes a Kudumbi, a lower caste a slave, a freedman who's from Java, who is a church painter. And then we have also a Gujarati boy who's described as a Ladino forro, so he's a freed kid, but he's such a cultural insider that he's a Ladino. So it gives us a really interesting picture of what slavery looked like. And African slaves were clearly really wanted in indigenous courts, so this is a deed of sale for a boy at the end of the 18th century from the Ernakulam State Archives in Kochi of this Shaktan Tampuran, who was very famous for really desiring African slaves, and in fact forced the Dutch governor, Johannes van Engelbeck, to give him 5 of his slaves, even though Engelbeck had said that it would destroy, it would be very painful for the family because they were fond of these slaves. There's a set of manumission records, which is pretty rare, but it did give us a picture of what kind of slaves you had even in a place like Goa. And of course, who was manumitted is not a representative sample, but it is interesting that there's only one Ethiopian in those records. Most of them are described as being from, Kurumbi, which is again this lower caste, that would be technically Shudra. But there's also sort of geographical designations. So there's Balaghat, which means on the other side of the Ghats, the mountains. Gatwal is a really interesting category because it could either mean from the actual Ghats themselves, or this is another possibility, they could be even coming from the Bay of Bengal, where a lot of enslaving was happening through with Portuguese and Arakanese cooperation. And you have fishermen castes that are going up and down, and clearly castes, there's very few upper caste slaves and no Brahmins among the upper castes. But in terms of the history, so in Kochi today, there is a kind of microcosm of Goan castes, including Konkani Kudumbis, who are sort of organizing and trying to get reserve status in Kerala today. And so you can still see the ways in which these histories of slave raiding and escape made these coasts. The villages showed that actually you have this kind of much more domestic slavery, including sexual slavery, because you see lots of Shudra women, especially with illegitimate children, like by incognito, whose baptism is often sponsored by Bagankars or other powerful village figures. And then lower caste again seem to have been interestingly early adopters of Christianity. And Chaudharis, who sort of replaced Brahmins as village administrators, showed the greatest kind of social networks. Like, so they might have godparents. One might be a slave woman and the other might be a Brahmin Gaunkar. So you have these really extensive social networks that are happening there. And marriage records, too, can be really interesting because one of the things that you see is this kind of really slippery line between poverty, lower caste status, formal enslaved status, and other forms of dependency, especially orphanhood, which is really interesting. And you have some descriptions of the kind of social lives that you can get from these records. And you also can find evidence of sort of labor conditions, which I find really interesting. So this is reported in a very famous book about the history of the church by a Franciscan called Paulo da Trindade. And he's reporting this as a miracle of this, in the construction of this church. But of course, I'm reading it being like, this is labor conditions of what it's like to be a slave, because this guy is being forced to knock down this, and he's described as a begarin. So the begad, like the debt bondage is right there in that Portuguese loanword. And so I mean, the kinds of sources that you can get to really think about this is astounding if you think about the Goan archives. The Livro de Posturas, for example, have these market regulations that often touched on how, give us a sense of what slaves were up to. So clearly there was some sort of freedom, so they were getting drunk and hanging out on the streets of Goa, and clearly they were running away constantly because ferrymen were being forced to post bonds in order to ensure that they weren't sort of transporting runaway slaves. This becomes a real sort of state concern, and we have letters from the surrounding kingdoms of the Portuguese that who would write and talk about the problems of policing these slaves. So, for example, this woman is, the Dalvis are sort of, the Linga Dalvis are kind of an upwardly mobile caste under the Marathas, and this guy's wife is kidnapped by these Brahmins, like the Rage Prabhu, and sold to a Kalavant. So basically sold into sexual slavery, and this court, the Savantwadi's court, is now intervening on behalf of this man to have his wife returned. And then you can also see, it specifically says a black man and woman ran away, and clearly states were cooperating to return slaves. And finally, this one is just heartbreaking. This is a woman who sold her baby and then moved the court to intercede to have the child returned to her. But the Virador of Sunda basically writes back to the Portuguese secretary saying, don't pay any attention to her. We spent money on this kid. Unless she pays us back, we're not giving you the kid back. And so what I want to suggest from all of this is that looking at slaves and slave mobility across, one of the things that we have to be really careful about is reifying political boundaries for the early modern. Like, these are really, really porous and fragile borders. And there's clearly state interest in policing and enforcing them, but mobility was a serious way in which you could actually go it was a double-edged sword. It was both a way into enslavement and a way out of it. And then sort of paying attention to that distinction between elite projects of sort of enforcing spatial or even identity boundaries as opposed to the ways in which subaltern peoples actually live their lives. And finally, a part of this project actually involved ethnography, and I did this work in Karvi village, a fisherman caste. It's a lower caste village. And what was really, really disturbing was that even though they are themselves lower caste, one of the things that I documented was how they were forcing untouchables to perform temple labor. And so this is a Maringan temple. So this is actually, it's an untouchable god. It is only the god of the untouchable community there. They live in a segregated part of the village. And the other, the Karvis, who are both the Mahajans and the Gankars of the village, said, well, only they really worship that god. But they had been trying to sort of build up this temple complex for this god on their own terms. But the original Compromiso listed this god as one of the gods of the Mahajan temple. And so now basically the temple head told me very proudly that he said that he would take away their land if they didn't come back and perform. And so like these boys playing the drums were being forced, and he said very proudly, this is the first time in 7 years they've come back to play the drums. So this is what forced labor looks like. Thank you.
So the story I'm going to tell today started not in Arabia, but in the wooded hamlet of Stone Ridge, New York. And it begins with a great deal of hope and good intentions, but ends on a lot less positive note, shaped by well-established patterns of exploitation, slavery, trauma, disease, racism, abuse, and what historians love to refer to as unintended consequences. So the story of these freed slave children that I'll discuss today has been covered by Matthew Hopper in Slaves of One Master to analyze the intersections of slavery and empire in Arabia. Building on his work, I'm actually taking a different angle here to reframe it within the context of another empire, which is the American Empire, and how ideas about race, slavery, religion, and education crossed oceans and borders and merged with local Arabian politics and British imperial and missionary practices during this era. So in August of 1889, 3 students from the Reformed Church of America's Theological Seminary, which is based in New Brunswick, New Jersey, traveled to Stone Ridge to meet with their mentor and professor, Reverend John G. Lansing. The purpose of their meeting was to discuss the future of their newly founded missionary organization, which they called the Arabian Mission. The goals of the Arabian Mission were expressed in its plan of action, which noted, quote, "The object of the mission in accordance to its original plan is the evangelization of Arabia. Our effort should be exerted directly among and for Muslims, including the slave population. Our main methods are preaching, Bible distribution, itinerating, medical work, and school work. Our aim is to occupy the interior of Arabia from the coast as a base." The second goal of reaching freed slaves was perhaps inspired by Lansing's father, who'd served for decades as a missionary with the American Presbyterian Mission in Egypt. The Presbyterian Church had a history of educating freed slave children both in the United States and in Egypt. The practice of opening schools for freed slave children had also taken off amongst British missionaries. In 1860, the Church Missionary Society, or CMS, opened the African Asylum section of their school in Nasik, India. Of course, the work of the British missionary David Livingstone in Africa and his martyrdom in 1874 was also an important catalyst for many Protestant missionaries, both in Great Britain and also in the United States. More importantly for the Arabian Mission, the Scottish Free Church's Keith Falconer Mission had opened a freed slave school a few years earlier in Sheikh Othman in current-day Yemen. So in 1888, just a year before the founding of the Arabian Mission, the Keith Falconer Mission had taken in 62 rescued slave children from Ethiopia. One of its reports claimed that they were instilling morals that were completely lacking in Ethiopia. As one freed slave girl allegedly told a missionary, quote, "Before we came here, we did not know there was any difference between right and wrong. But since we came, we have learned that there is." By 1889, 1 year after opening the school, there were only 51 children left alive. 11 of them had died of various diseases. Two of the three founders of the Arabian Mission, Samuel Zwemer and James Cantine, set out for Arabia in 1889, and they moved quickly, opening their first missionary station in Basra in current-day Iraq. By 1891, only 2 years after their arrival, they had opened a second missionary station in Bahrain. New missionaries also joined during this time, including Samuel Zwemer's younger brother, Peter, who arrived in 1892. Peter also moved quickly. He established Muscat as the Arabian Mission's third station in 1893, where he hoped to open a school for African children. Before I talk about Peter's school, I want to put his goals in the context of American domestic projects back in the United States that also served as important models for these missionaries. The Reformed Church of America, or RCA, had a long history of attempting to convert Native Americans and African slaves, dating back to the Dutch migration to the New World in the early 17th century. This goal soon extended to other missionary societies in the United States. By the late 19th century, when Peter was a young theology student, missionaries had also opened industrial boarding schools for Native American children, at times subsidized by the US government. Indeed, by 1885, so 4 years before the founding of the Arabian Mission, there were 106 Native American schools spread throughout the United States. One of the most famous schools, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, was opened in 1879 by Army officer Richard Pratt and was just 160 miles away from the theological seminary that Peter attended before coming to Arabia. The RCA would also build upon the Carlisle model to open its own Native American